David, thanks for joining us. All right, we'll wait one more minute and then we'll go and get started.
Nice to see you, Dr. Schweitzer. Sorry, my computer was on mute when I joined earlier, so if you said something, I didn't hear you.
Oh, great. Thanks so much for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. And one of my goals is to, have this recorded and then up on our website. I think, as all of us know, the first step in any research project is getting things cleared through the IRB. And one of the first things I have every incoming PhD student do, every new research assistant, is go through city training to have that foundation. And so that's really step one. And we really work sort of hand in hand. And I appreciate the incredible support we have from the IRB in supporting us in getting things, moving pretty quickly, being pretty reactive to concerns, and sort of finding ways to get our work done, and at the core, ethically done. So, David, let me turn this over to you, and thank you very much in advance for all of the help that you've given us in the past, for being here today, and for all of the help you will give us as you support our research going forward.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad it's a Friday morning and not a Friday afternoon, because then my jokes get really bad, which I'll try to limit because I know we're recording. While if I don't know if Mary or you're the host, but if you could enable screen sharing, that would be great. And while we're doing that, I'm going to come back to this at the very end. The one thing I want to let everybody know, I have a bunch of secondary objectives that I want to accomplish with the talk today. And we're going to talk about everything that hopefully you came here to hear about IRB submission basics and the overview, and some basic examples and what considerations we'd make. But my primary objective is just to convince you all that we are here, and we are here to help you. And I'll come back to that at the end, but that's really, if you take nothing away from this presentation but that, I hope you do. I have some really good colleagues at the IRB. We are not, I know there's a lot of researchers out there in the world who have had horrible IRB experiences, and if I was at those institutions, I would feel the same way. But from an ethical standpoint, a research facilitation standpoint, we really do want to see your projects get approved, and we really want to help you get there. So even if some of this stuff is tedious and annoying, know that at the core of it, we are very supportive of what you're doing over there. And we're a friendly face. We're here to help. So I hope, we got screen sharing. All right, and I assume everybody can see my screen okay?
Great.
All right, let's get going. So Dr. Schweitzer, I got an outline from Mary that you asked for. I tried to stay really close to it. And if I'm a little bit off, I apologize. But I think I got it pretty close. Okay, so we're gonna start off now. What is the IRB? So if you're here and you're like, wait a second, they're telling me IRB, what is this? What are we even talking about? The IRB is an institutional review board. Institutional review boards in the United States, it's required by regulation, in places like the UK, they have research go through a National Health Service or some type of federal agency. In the United States, research is reviewed independently by an independent entity at the respective institution. The Institutional Review Board is both committees and both staff like myself who work for the overall Human Research Protection Program. And what the IRB does is we review all human subjects research. Now, that includes federally funded research, industry-sponsored, investigator-initiated, and whether you have funding or not, we review all human research here at Penn. It comes through the IRB office. And I referenced the regulations. The IRB is basically mandated by the Department of Health and Human Services under the National Research Act of 1974. And the Department of Health and Human Services mandates the role of the IRB, what engaged in research means, what IRB membership requirements look like, different requirements for pregnant women, children, and prisoners. And the cool thing is we actually just got the regulations updated in 2018. To be hopeful, naively hopeful probably for just a split second, it was actually the process working out as it should. During the entire Obama administration, researchers across the country submitted comments and feedback regarding the new revised common rule. And that's why now compared to pre-2018, the federal government heard the concerns of social and behavioral researchers like yourselves, and we now have expanded exemption criteria. We now have removed a lot of administrative burdens that were in place before then. I think Penn was a little bit ahead of the curve on some of these changes, but I digress. So this is what the IRB looks like at Penn. We're under like an umbrella called the Office of Regulatory Affairs. The reason why I'm showing this slide to a Wharton group is I just want you all to know that, like, compared to some other peer institutions, so if you were at Harvard, for instance, there would be like a university IRB, or there might be even a business school IRB, and then a medical school IRB. Whereas at Penn, there is only one IRB office. So I both will come to Wharton and I will go to, the Abramson Cancer Center group. I could be there next Friday. It's good and bad. It's got its pros and cons. It allows consistency throughout the program. It also, creates some resource challenges on our end, but it's all good. This is what it looks like. Now, when you all think of IRBs, you're probably thinking of like a bunch of crotchety professors with elbow patches tearing apart your projects. That's partially true, not really that. But most of the IRB committees are actually reviewing clinical trials in greater than minimal risk at the health system. In practice, most of the research that comes out of the university, we get thousands of submissions from across the university every year. And I would say, under 20 of them will go to our convened social behavioral IRB. And honestly, I think in the past 2 years, I don't think we've had any Wharton school submissions have to go under full review. And what that means is you're basically being reviewed by a single IRB analyst. This is just some more information about what the IRB office looks like, how much we oversee at Penn. I know you don't really, aren't particularly interested in it, but it's useful to know in case you catch somebody on the IRB contact list, maybe one of our coordinators, and you tell them about a benign behavioral intervention and they're like, what the heck is that? That's a little bit of backdrop as to why. Okay, that's a little bit of an overview of the IRB. We both have our committees that review over, greater than minimal risk research, and we have individual IRB members like myself who review projects like yours. But I think the first big question we want to talk about is IRB review even required? So for the purposes of this presentation, you could ignore the FDA definitions unless one of you is working with some type of device in collaboration with somebody from the School of Medicine. Maybe call me later. We'll have a separate sidebar discussion. But for everybody else, we want to look at the OHRP definitions of human subjects research. And that's OHRP, systematic investigation designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. We'll talk a little bit more about these definitions in a second. And for human subject is basically, are you getting data through interaction with an individual, or are you interacting with an individual's private identifiable information? So let's get into the weeds a little bit more about what this means. So when we talk about research, there's a few things that could be happening for those of you who work in businesses, outside of your education, and maybe you work in an educational setting, there's certain times when you could be doing like a quality improvement project. Maybe it could be at the Wharton School. If you're doing a project, maybe you're getting some survey data, but the primary aim of that project is to improve practices within your department. You're not really trying to shake up the literature, contribute to generalizable knowledge. In that case, that might be considered quality improvement. That's not research. That doesn't need to come to the IRB. If you have any like questions about like, I think a lot of the confusion comes in, it's like something may not require IRB review, but you don't feel comfortable saying that yourself, we will help you with that. And I'll get to that in a little bit too. And you could do a quality improvement study. You know, you could be working in a school or an part of a department. You could be doing something like this. You can still publish on it. This is kind of like where we try to be facilitative at Penn and just be honest and transparent. Like, listen, different institutions, different publications have different thresholds for what's research and what's quality improvement. So if you know, like, so sometimes people will just be safe and submit something as research to the IRB because they're not sure. But other times, if you know and you're confident that you can submit to a publication saying like, hey, this was part of an internal quality improvement project, IRB review was not submitted, that is normally okay. And then sometimes if you're getting like grant through like maybe like an NIH or an NSF or some type of outside foundation, the general advice I would give you is talk to the grant officer ahead of time. I mean, this is one of my pain points is, you know, different grant officers at different sponsors, you know, they'll all have, you know, we'll talk about some nitty gritty stuff like what's de-identified versus what's publicly available. And there's different thresholds. Talk to your department, talk to your grant officer if you're getting funding about whether or not IRB review is required. Because there's lots of times where I can make a strong case, be like, hey, you're getting de-identified data. IRB review isn't required. And they'll be like, nope, we need a letter from the IRB that says that. It's annoying, but on the positive side, let us know what you need and we'll help you get all squared away. So we mentioned, you know, I mentioned the definition of human subjects. You don't have, you know, any interaction with private identifiable data. This is tricky because, like I said, some sponsoring agencies will make you get an IRB determination even if you're working with de-identified data, even though that's kind of a bit more stringent than the regulations require. That's why I say consult with them first. But per the regulations, if you're working with fully de-identified data, like if you get data from a collaborator, if it's coming from somewhere else, you have no way to identify the participants who are in that study, that doesn't need to come to the IRB. If you're getting, when I say publicly available data, like if you have access to data that I could also access on my computer and that there's no special agreements or permissions that are needed, that's not private data and that wouldn't require IRB approval either. If you have any questions about whether or not something needs IRB approval when you're putting your projects together, please reach out, let us know. This is a busy slide, but what I'm going to tell you about this is that, and I kind of alluded to this already, we will review and give you guidance on any type of submission or project you're working on. So even if it doesn't require IRB review, but you need some type of formal letter from the IRB, we can provide it for you. So if you're not doing human subjects research, you don't have to submit to the IRB, but we recognize there's sometimes you might have to get a letter. Let us know, we'll provide it from you. One thing we'll be talking about a lot throughout the rest of the presentation is exempt review. I hate the term exemption because exemption implies that like you don't have to submit to the IRB for review. There's some like regulatory jargony background for this. Like theoretically, Penn could make policies that say Dr. Schweitzer could do exemption determinations. But instead, Penn's policies say, no, the IRB does exemption determinations. That's why when we say exempt from IRB review, investigators always get thrown for a loop. But at Penn, the IRB makes exempt determinations. We try to do them as fast as possible and to keep that administrative burden off of the faculty. So hopefully that's like a good scenario that works for everybody. And what I will tell you is most of the projects we receive from your group historically are exempt projects. So if you're in this realm where you think you might need to go to committee for review, or you're doing something that's like really, really sensitive, you know, maybe like interviewing sex workers with HIV or something that like that has other implications, or you know, maybe asking questions about criminal behavior or child abuse, things like that. Yeah, that type of sensitive information might kick up our ears in our review level, but most of the projects we see from Wharton are exempt. And exempt basically means ongoing IRB review isn't required, but you still have to submit to the IRB. Okay, so what are some examples of exempt research? This is most of what we see: surveys, interviews, observations. You know, generally it's not research that involves children unless it's in like an educational setting. Prisoners, anything that's FDA regulated typically doesn't qualify for exemption. Lots of, you might be doing, you know, stuff in the behavioral lab that involves surveys or benign interventions that randomize between groups, or you could be working with collaborators or sponsors or other institutions where you could get data from somewhere. And usually research with existing data qualifies for exemption too. Another new exemption category, which I'm pretty excited, which I've been pretty excited about because it, you know, allows us to reduce some review and administrative burden for researchers like yourself, is the benign behavioral intervention, you know. And this is like, you know, things that study behavior or psychological states. Generally, behavioral interventions aren't like physically invasive, and there might be some alterations to the environment. I think basically what like, and we'll talk about what we look for in benign behavioral interventions in a later slide, but like, if it's truly behavioral in nature, we're really just trying to make that assessment like, you know, is some type of medical or physician input needed in this review? Is there some type of heightened risk, or is it really just two behavioral conditions? Okay. That covers the, do I even need to submit to the IRB? Honestly, most of you are probably doing exempt projects. So let's say you're doing an exempt project and you do need to submit. That's our, you know, our baseline moving forward now. Everybody's got to do city training. I'm sorry about it. I wish there was a world where, you know, this part of education wasn't privatized and you didn't have to do all these modules and we could have more interactive discussion about ethics, but there's a lot of really good information about the historical background, and you know, the training can be good if you go into it with a good attitude, or it can be annoying. But this is how you do it. It's required for everybody. The good news is, a couple years ago, we did. Some of you have been around longer than 3 years. Will remember we used to always ask you for refresher courses. Now, if you do city training once, you're good forever. So I know a lot of faculty were really happy about that. No more refresher courses, no more every 3 years doing the, hey, this is what happened at the Tuskegee tragedy. You know what I mean? Like, honestly, city, in my opinion, it's a very basic, it's a very beginner course. Ongoing education about human research ethics should be occurring at an interpersonal level, and it should be occurring with faculty advisors and colleagues. That's my personal opinion for the recording for future purposes. Bad joke, sorry. So here's some just quick basic instructions on how to do city training. This is more for the recording and for your own internal documentation purposes. This information is also available on the IRB website under the city training guidance section. So you go into city program, you log in through your institution. Go ahead, Dr. Schweitzer.
David, you know, Wendy De La Rosa has a question. Can she ask that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for pointing that out. I wasn't, yes, please go ahead, Wendy.
Hi, David. My name is Wendy De La Rosa. I'm a new faculty member here. If I've received city training through other institutions, does my city training transfer over
Yes, it
Or
does.
should I? Okay, great.
Yes, it does. It's the same no matter what institution you're at. I think one of the things is if you're not affiliated with an institution, city will charge you. So like you want to log in through an institution to make sure, Penn pays for it. I think that's the biggest thing. I actually don't even know how much it costs. But yeah, if you have it from another institution, if you add your name in HSCRA and it says no, but you have a certificate available, this is actually the directions on how to obtain your certificate if you have it too. And we're not going to say, oh, it's older than 3 years or anything like that. If you've gotten it at another institution, we accept it. You are now an ethical researcher per city. Sorry, I'm being snarky.
I love the humor. Keep it going. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you. It's hard. It's hard on Zoom. I used to make a lot of bad jokes in person and people were more forgiving, but in Zoom, I'm like, oh man. Anyway.
It's being recorded. Keep
I
going.
know I'm being recorded. There we go. Here's just some more information about city training. Oh, I went back. Hold on. There we go. Sorry, my submission froze a little bit. So that's city training. That's city training in a nutshell. Now we're going to talk briefly about submitting to the IRB. Submitting to the IRB is through a system called HSCRA. Hopefully one day in the future, for those future participants viewing this, we will have a new and better system. For now in 2021, we're still stuck in 2008 with HSCRA. My apologies. Anything exempt, expedited, convened review has to go through HSCRA. Honestly, like I joke about the system. The important part about HSCRA is actually the fact that it gets routed to your faculty. So your faculty advisor would be listed as your PI, and it also gets routed to your department head. So functionally, that's, in my opinion, that's the most important part of HSCRA, that your faculty advisor, the Wharton School, is assessing the scientific and scholarly validity of your studies. The IRB is not doing that. The IRB is doing a basic ethical review. We're looking to see that the exemption, that does qualify for exemption, that it is indeed research that's minimal risk and doesn't need review by a convened IRB. But in terms of like, is this a worthwhile study? The IRB doesn't actually talk about it. That gets determined by your faculty advisors. It gets determined by the department chairs. And that's something I'm always pushing on the IRB member side. If there's like scientific questions on the on a really low risk study, I'll say, listen, that might be fair, but that's not within our purview. We can maybe raise it collegially, but it shouldn't be a condition of our approval. And that's something, too, hey, is this a good population to ask this question? Is this the appropriate methodology for this population? Is this an appropriate sample size? There are questions that should be assessed on the work. Just want to be very clear about that too. And I said, as I mentioned earlier, if all of you are students, you should be selecting a member of the Penn faculty as your principal investigator. Even if we understand that you might be the principal investigator in, for all intents and purposes. But it's just the way, like I said in the beginning, the system is a system that applies to all of Penn. If we were the Wharton School IRB, some other institutions might say like principal investigator and have a separate slot for faculty advisor. So think of the principal investigator slot as the faculty advisor slot. And even if you're the primary investigator and you're under study contact, we understand that distinction. Okay, let's go through some things that we want to see in an IRB application. So survey studies, this information applies to interviews and focus groups too. One of the big things that we're thinking about when we're reviewing any type of behavioral methodology is, are you collecting sensitive information? There's going to be another slide in a few minutes that talks about is there an interview guide? Do you have copies of the questions if it's going to be a survey that's going out? The heart of this is that we're looking at the consent. we want to make sure that the consent reflects the questions that you're asking. And we want to make sure your confidentiality plan reflects the type of data that you're collecting too. So like a lot of people think like, oh, I'm collecting data that's pretty sensitive and I'm going to have identifiers. The IRB is not going to let me do that. That's not true. That's a myth. What the IRB is going to do is make sure that the informed consent form reflects that you're collecting sensitive data and that you have an appropriate confidentiality plan. So if you say like, oh, I'm collecting anonymous, non-sensitive data, yeah, if you only have a 1-sentence confidentiality plan, that's going to satisfy me in most situations. But if, like I said, situations like, maybe there's some type of something that would impact somebody's reputation, somebody's employee, like if you're going into a place of employment and things that their boss might not want to hear about, things that could put them at criminal liability, things that like might be really, if we're talking about abuse or something that could, we understand that like conversations are difficult and that's like in the context of everyday life, but we still want to make sure that like people are appropriately informed of what we're going to sign up for. That's why we always focus on sensitive information. So keep that in mind when you're talking about your research objectives and what type of questions you're going to be asking. We understand that, especially in an interview context, things are semi-structured, things could be loose. You're going to go with the flow of the conversation. But we just want to make sure you're mindful that you know the types of topics you're going to be asking and that you're adequately informing the participants of that in advance. One thing I want to point out too, because I have seen it from some Wharton investigators. I don't know if they were under Dr. Schweitzer's oversight or not, but you could be doing research in an established educational setting. And I want to point this out because that type of research qualifies for exemption. And you could theoretically enroll children and it still be exempt research. And what we want to see in those instances, are you going into a school? Are you going into a college? Are you looking at some type of curriculum? So yeah, you might be asking questions about it. There might be surveys, there might be interviews. But if you're doing it in an established educational setting, let the IRB know. And if that's the case, children may not even prevent you from, like enrolling children may not even prevent you from getting an exempt determination from the IRB. The idea is here that, the regulators had enough foresight to understand that, educational settings are constantly learning, constantly improving. That's why there's regulatory flexibility with quality improvement projects, and that's why we have it in educational settings too. We understand that educators are constantly trying to improve their curriculum. So if that's what you're doing and it's not a quality improvement project, make sure that's clear in your IRB application too. We talked about research with data qualifying for exemption. So like, let us know what level of identifiers you're going to receive. As I alluded to earlier, it might not be human subjects research, but maybe you're getting a coded data set and you're getting some things like city, state, or zip code. Maybe it's coded and you have access to the identifiers. Sometimes you might be working with a sponsoring agency and you're getting stuff. You don't have access to identifiers, but you have to sign an agreement that requires you get an exemption determination from the IRB. We just want to see, where is the data coming from? What are you doing to protect the data? Is there anything from the original data source or the custodian of the data? Are there any limitations on what you can do and what you can research with it? Kind of convey those. Did you need to sign or obtain any agreements to obtain that data? And also, like, if you needed to enter into a data use agreement with another institution because you were going to do some data sharing, we don't necessarily require that as part of the application, but we might inform you as part of the review that you need to get that completed. Back to some of the core stuff, surveys, interviews. Can you use SurveyMonkey, MTurk, Qualtrics? Yes, these are all, you can use all these methods, but I would consult with your school. I mean, I think like most of the studies coming out of Wharton are utilizing Qualtrics. So if that's the preferred vendor for survey, use Qualtrics. but MTurk might be used for recruitment. I would also recommend checking out the MTurk guidance on our website. One thing that comes up with MTurk researchers is, there's different things that, if you're going to be doing like time checks or anything like that, MTurk researchers might complain. That's really the only time we've gotten complaints about Wharton studies at the IRB level. And Dr. Schweitzer and I have talked about it. It's making sure those MTurk, all those MTurk studies, making sure that the researchers are really clear, like about how they're being compensated, whether there are any time checks or anything like that in there. If you follow our MTurk guidance on the website, you should be in pretty good shape. Can you audio record interviews? The common myth we hear all the time is like, oh, it's audio recording, so that's an identifier. We can't do it. No, you can. You can work with identifiable information. We understand. Just let the participant know that you're audio recording, get their permission. If you're going to be sharing it with like an outside service, let them know about that too, and put that in your IRB application. Like yeah, we're getting it, we're getting the audio recordings transcribed by this platform, and we've built that into the consent form too. So it's all allowable. Just make sure you're clear and upfront about it with your interview participants.
And David, same goes for video too, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Well, and we think like a lot of times there's this conception of like there's questions about identifiability, and a lot of researchers get really tripped up in wanting to make things anonymous because they know that anonymous research goes through the IRB faster, and then they think that means that they can't use face identifiers. It's like, no, you can just get consent for it and be clear about that in your IRB application.
Thanks.
And I talked about this, like, what do we need in terms of this? I kind of talked about this already in the context of sensitivity, and that's why what do we need in terms of surveys and interview guides? We're really just trying to get an assessment that you have a good plan in place for getting consent and approaching and recruiting those subjects. So focus groups, it's a lot of the same. The only thing I would add to what we would need to see in focus groups is be a little bit more mindful in your informed consent document about the fact that you really can't guarantee privacy in focus groups, and kind of address that. So sometimes, like, yeah, focus groups can be pretty benign in certain situations, particularly in like marketing situations. But there could be other situations where, like we've seen studies where they're doing focus groups and it's in an employment setting, and people could be divulging information that could, put their job at risk. And we've asked researchers to be mindful, like, hey, so how have you thought about this risk in this context? Like, you really can't guarantee anybody's privacy there. What's your feeling on that? And it could be permissible, but just making sure it's really clear and upfront in the informed consent process. And if the privacy risk really is high, so we've seen some prisoner research where they wanted to do focus groups and like the content was very risky. So we might ask the investigator, like, hey, so what was your thought process as to why you need to do focus groups and why you need to do interviews? But like I said, the only time we'll really ask that question is depending on the sensitivity. But that's something you can be thinking about when you're determining the type of methodology you're going to use. If you're using a validated instrument, you can just reference, you could say it's validated, and I can Google it. I don't need you to upload it. So if it's something that's been used multiple times and I can find it on the internet, I don't need you to upload it as part of your application. Can you store data on your laptop or on your jump drive? Every school has their own individual, data requirements. Like I would say, if you're not friends with your local service provider, with somebody from IT, I would say get them involved. Get the university to give you the support to do your research that you need to do. To give you, if there's requirements around like the use of jump drives, get them to give you a jump drive that they deem to be secure. That's my biggest piece of advice. If you kind of loop the security professionals in at the onset and at the training, kind of like how we do here with the IRB requirements, that makes confidentiality and protection of data so much easier. Can you videotape interviews? We probably, we talked about this briefly. How do I complete the PHI section? If you're not, PHI refers to protected health information. So if you're not working within a health setting, you can say no. That's like a question that trips up people in the HSCRA application all the time. I mentioned benign behavioral interventions earlier. So one of the things I want to point out, like, I'm super happy that this is now an exemption category, because this is something I argued with IRB professionals all the time. Like, seeing all the, especially stuff from the Wharton Behavioral Lab, where I'm just like, why does this need extra level of review if they're just on a computer or they're just in this simulation? Like, this feels like it's a complete administrative burden. It's not like a clinical trial the way that we think of it. So we've really done nationally, we're doing a better job at making that distinguishing that. But like I alluded to earlier, one of the downsides of also being a health system IRB is we also review clinical trials. So it may not be evident that you're doing something in like the Wharton Behavioral Lab. Be really clear about that. Be really clear that you're not doing something physically invasive and what the intervention actually is, because with certain wording, you can make something look like it's a clinical trial and prompt a lot of unnecessary questions from the IRB. So be really clear that the intervention is minimally, it's really, even though you're doing randomization, like, that's really minimally invasive. It just involves a computer task or some type of language exercise, or being given different series of vignettes. Like, be clear about what the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 conditions are actually seeing and experiencing. And then also, specifically, if you're doing some type of randomization, comment on whether health outcomes are being addressed. That's an NIH thing. Like, randomization, in an IRB member's mind, it triggers the question of, is this a clinical trial? Now, most of the studies, if not all, that we see from Wharton are not clinical trials, but we have seen some where the funding agency is like, nope, this is a clinical trial. You're assessing health outcome data. So be really clear. If you're doing some type of randomization too, be really clear about what you're, maybe put a little bit more detail in your objectives section of your protocol too. Quick note on informed consent. Should you use the informed consent template on the IRB website? My recommendation, use it as a guide. If you're doing a really simple study, if you're doing something that doesn't have a lot of procedures, our template consent is not going to be a good tool for you. It could be a good tool if you're partnering with somebody in the health system and there's like, you're working with HIPAA data and there's like 16 visits and there's like all types of template language you have to cover. But if you're doing an interview or a survey or something like that, my recommendation, take a look at the required elements of consent here. And these are available everywhere. You could just Google basic elements of consent if you don't have these slides available. And you can make like a really simple 1-page script for most interview or focus group studies. It's going to cover everything that the IRB wants to see. And there really isn't even a good template I can provide for that, because the template line might be just as long as like a description of the procedures. Like, hey, we are going to ask you to do an interview that's going to take approximately 45 minutes. So keep it simple, keep it short, and really just focus on getting answers to the questions, making sure people know what they're signing up for, and most importantly, knowing that it is voluntary. Other quick, we have 4 minutes left on the timer, so let us know if you're working with the city of Philadelphia or another institution. Let us know if you're doing some type of deception. Deception research is permissible, but we do ask questions about it. We'll ask you, is it practical to let people know about the deception afterwards and do some type of debriefing? Can you let them know in a basic way in the beginning of the study, that you might not tell them the purpose, or none of those things practical. Just kind of speak to it and why you're doing it. It's all related to how the IRB assesses waivers of consent.
Professor De La Rosa has one more question.
Yeah.
Oh, Maurice, I'm professor.
Uh,
That's no,
I'm getting
David,
used to it, Wendy.
I'm still not used to it. David, I had another question. You've been talking about all of this as individual studies, but as you
Yeah.
know, like oftentimes we have like 8, 12, 20, 30 studies within one research stream. Could we apply for an IRB saying, these are the types of questions that we would ask, examples like, but not limited to A, B, C, D, E?
Yeah, I would say for the purposes of this presentation, in general, yes, talk to the IRB about your options in terms of like what I refer to as like umbrella type research. We've had arrangements like that with like historians doing oral history projects. So we've approved protocols where it's like, oh, this is the protocol title was like oral history class 500 or something, whatever the class was, and basically everything that the professor was doing in that class to teach and train all the students, all the copies of the consent, consents and scripts that they would be using, the types of research questions they would be asking, and that was all in a kind of an effort to prevent like 20 or 30 individual IRB applications. So yeah. That was the long of it. The short of it is, yeah, we can talk separately after this presentation that like we are definitely open to those types of arrangements. We're a huge institution. I have no interest in pumping up the IRB metrics or anything like that. Like, I don't care. I'm happy to review less protocols, please. If you are doing research with another institution and you have questions about an IRB reliance agreement, we could talk about that for 45 minutes alone. I recommend reaching out to Patrick Stanko at the IRB. He's our reliance expert. Of course, keep me in the loop too, because I might be involved with the IRB review on our end. But long and short of it, we don't want to like have multiple. If we don't have to, we don't want multiple IRBs reviewing the same project. These questions will be here for your reference. I want to get to the end. If you're doing research internationally, we want to see that spoken to in your application. We'll want to see some type of local context. Reach out to us if you have a question about what that means. We're very flexible in our interpretation of local context because there's lots of situations where there aren't local IRBs. And for translated materials, if you're doing something in another language outside of English, kind of speak to that in your application too, how you're going to get consent and how you're going to do recruitment and how you're going to get those materials translated. And then I am at the end. Maurice, I can close here if we're out of time, but I have a couple quick cases.
All right, let's go through one.
Then I'm going to skip this one because this one's not human subjects research. This one is a simple exempt application. And the last one is, an investigator is randomizing participants between two conditions. The researcher's objectives related to tobacco packaging and how participants might be willing to purchase certain types of tobacco products. The control group will answer follow-up questions related to standard packaging. The intervention group will look up follow-up questions with new packaging, including explicit images and graphic warnings. So the reason why I came up with this as a case is this is what I would call, this could be a benign behavioral intervention. So this is a scenario where like in your IRB application, you'll be like, want to be really clear, like what are the objectives of your research? There's a version of this project that could be a clinical trial regulated by the FDA. They could be submitting this data to the FDA for marketing materials. That could totally impact it. Or it could be a series of vignettes that you're doing in partnership with Annenberg, and you're doing it in the behavioral lab, and you're actually doing a study about risk aversion and how and risk perception. So this is an area where like your objectives might actually impact the questioning and the how the IRB looks and reviews at your project. Like whether this was taking place in a smoking cessation center or the Wharton Behavioral Lab might actually be a really important detail for the types of questions that the IRB would raise. But the similar types of studies we've seen from Wharton, these are typically benign behavioral interventions. So put together a good consent, let us know what those conditions are, let us know how you're protecting the data, and let us know what you're going to tell people in the consent about the two conditions, or whether there's going to be any deception or debriefing involved. And here's some contact information for you. I'm Dave Heagerty. I'm the Associate Director of the IRB. Any of you can reach out to me for any questions you have. No question is too small for me to answer. And Diana Flogel, she's an administrator analyst at the IRB. She's new, but she's not new to the world of qualitative research. She's a PhD with a ton of qualitative research experience. So she's been a tremendous asset on my end on helping students through the IRB application process, and she's fantastic. So reach out to any of us, reach out to Patrick Stanko if you have questions about reliance agreements. And again, I don't want to scare all of you off. We can end there if you would like
Great.
to.
Yeah, so David, I just want to, on behalf of all of the behavioral researchers here at Wharton, I just want to thank you for all the work you do. The IRB is, I see, sort of a collaborator in supporting our research, making sure we're dotting our I's, crossing our T's, getting things done right. Thanks for everything that you do. Thanks for your time here today. And thanks for being a great resource for us to reach out to, which I've done in the past, and I look forward to being in touch with you again, probably in the near future. So thank you so much. Thanks all of you for being here in person, and I really appreciate your willingness to have us host this on our website. Thank you, David.
Will do. Thanks so much for having me, everybody. Take care. Have a great day.